Sam Seder on the Majority Report. Emma Vigeland out today. Joining me now, Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer at Slate. And we're talking about this story in the New York Times that outlines how John Roberts acted in a way that I think is surprising for a lot of commentators in response to the Trump immunity case and the case involving January 6th and one other. Mark, we had talked just a little bit before this. There's sort of two stories here. One is the sort of the actual story and what it reveals about John Roberts. And the other is, how did they get this story and what's going on at the court that had them have these documents, which are incredibly revealing. And I'm talking about like emails between judges, it appears. And it's fascinating. And I want to get to that second, but I do think that's almost like almost a bigger story in some respects. But let's start with this. John Roberts, he just calls balls and strikes, right? I mean, that was his whole thing.
Well, it's what he told the Senate. It has not been his style as Chief Justice, at least over the last few years. And according to this report, he now is very MAGA-pilled. He's essentially in the tank for Trump in these major Trump cases. And he didn't have to be like dragged along by his colleagues to the right. No, he played the commanding role in shaping 3 decisions just last term that all came out for Trump in about as great a way as Trump could have possibly wanted. A trio of cases, which now the New York Times reports and CNN had already suggested, he sort of lassoed as his own and guided to an outcome that I think is really pretty dangerous for constitutional democracy. I'm sorry if that seems like an exaggeration. But when the liberals accused Roberts of putting Trump on a throne, making him a king above law, I mean, I think that's pretty clearly correct. And if Trump wins in November, he is going to be the first president in history who will be freed from the constitutional restraints that we assume presidents had to adhere to because of John Roberts and his machinations behind the scenes to make this trio of cases just a total victory for Trump and Trumpism.
And this comes as a big surprise. And what you and Dahlia Lithwick wrote a piece about it, and part of it was a mea culpa. It's not like you could have really changed the trajectory of John Roberts' career, but you guys said and largely this was the sort of like a mainstream view of John Roberts, and maybe he has changed in some way, or maybe you see that you got a 6-3 advantage on the court. There now you don't need those other 3. Now you don't need to function in that way. It's almost like we got the money in the bag. We're out of the bank. Let's now we're getting in the getaway car. But let's start with I don't know. What do you find? Which one of these stories is most egregious? Because one of the things that's an element of this is the way that there were attempts by the liberal minority on the court in a couple of these cases to sort of say, like, we're willing to compromise and almost give John Roberts a way of mitigating the absolutism of his rulings, and he just completely rejected them.
Yeah, and I think where that is most egregious is in the immunity case in Trump versus United States, where the Supreme Court granted Donald Trump absolute immunity for official acts, quote unquote, that he took while in Oval Office that are somehow within the realm of his core constitutional duties, which is defined very broadly. And we now know that during the drafting of that decision, the liberal justices came to John Roberts with an olive branch and said, we want to compromise with you on this decision. We don't want this to be another 6-3 decision with a conservative supermajority, just going as far as it wants. We have a vested interest in working out some kind of middle ground with you, at least on a few points. And John Roberts froze out the liberal justices. He did not even try to make any sort of compromise or find any middle ground at any point. And, I think that's the story that made Dahlia and me issue this kind of mea culpa, because up until even last term, John Roberts Roberts had evinced some desire to chart a middle course where one was available and where he could do it without betraying some of his core principles. You know, he's definitely a member of the conservative legal movement. He believes in a strong president, at least a strong Republican president. But, you know, we had thought that if there was a real meaningful effort by the liberals to give him most of what he wanted, but avoid a badly split partisan decision, that at least sometimes he would take that option. And now we know he's done doing that. He's finished working with the other side, crossing the aisle, so to speak, to try to find any kind of sensible middle ground. He wants to power the court to new conservative extremes. And I think that a key factor here is what you just mentioned, that this is now a 6-3 court, right? There's no more sort of like 5-4 split decisions where the liberals are on one side and conservatives on the other, and Roberts might try to work out some compromise to prevent it from looking so badly divided on political grounds. Now he is working with the flank of the court to his right, the Trump appointees and Thomas and Alito, and he is in some ways trying to out-MAGA them. He is trying to recapture his position as leader of the court. I think he felt like he lost in a few cases over the last few years where the 5 justices to his right powered the court to a extremely conservative decision, most obviously in Dobbs, where the chief was not ready to overrule Roe v. Wade. And I think the chief just decided, you know what, this is me losing, and losing sucks. Losing is for suckers. So I'm just going to refashion myself as the MAGA chief. And that is the story of the immunity case that was going on behind the scenes when people like Dahlia and I were saying, maybe there's some hope. We're confident that John Roberts doesn't want to break constitutional democracy. No, it turns out that he was eager to, from the moment this case hit their docket, we now know from a confidential memo, he was lobbying the justices behind the scenes well before oral arguments that they needed to take this case and give Trump pretty much everything he wanted.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. He really short-circuited. I mean, he basically said, this is interesting. I mean, you know, we don't have this type of insight into cases in a general sense, so it's hard to know how atypical this was. But he took this case and almost from the get-go basically said, here are the parameters in which we're going to decide this. Like, there's, you know, he created a baseline of like, we're definitely, going to town with this stuff. And that's basically it. What is also interesting, and because, you know, part of, at least in my experience in interviewing commentators about the court and court watchers, is that there's always been this sense that John Roberts is so keenly aware of the legacy of the court and whatnot, which I don't think that this article disproves, but I do think it comes down to, like, you can be keenly aware of the legacy of the court and understand what it's going to look like if the votes are 5-4, you know, as people are looking 40 years in the future. But if it's 6-3, you have a lot more protection. And I think that's like what's happened here. I mean, you know, this was always latent in him, but he was just waiting for the right opportunity, and the right opportunity is there. What I was also struck by was what, within the Times piece, a couple of like top experts on the court said was they've never, ever heard of this. He took a case from Alito that specifically was about January 6th, and he took it just coincidentally, I guess, 4 days after that article in the Times about Martha Alito and her was this when the tapes came out too, where like, you know, she's talking about Vergonia. We actually have a Vergonia t-shirt. It's no longer for sale. We sold out. But tell us about that, because that is also bizarre.
So I want to get to that, but first I just want to briefly respond to your first insight, which is really important here. I think that I have maybe even come on your show in the past and suggested that John Roberts cared about the court's institutional legitimacy as a good in itself.
I don't know if we've ever had anybody who comments on the court not say something to that effect.
And what I think we've learned is that he doesn't care about the institution in itself, like as a good in itself. He cares about how much he can get away with before he breaks the court, loses that legitimacy, and thereby loses his power, right? Because we all know the Supreme Court does not have any actual power, can't send an army to go enforce its decisions, right? It relies on the country believing in its integrity and choosing to follow its decisions. And so I think that's a subtle distinction in a lot of ways, but an important one. He really just gauges public opinion to the extent that it tells him how far he can push the court rightward. At least that's what he does nowadays. And part of the shock of this reporting from the New York Times is that rather than try to gather like legitimate public opinion and get a sense of where the country is, he's increasingly in an echo chamber listening to sycophants like Brett Kavanaugh and Neil Gorsuch, who immediately showered him with praise when he circulated a draft of his presidential immunity decision, told him it was, so brilliant and remarkable and implied it would stand the test of time. And so according to the Times, he really thought, John Roberts really thought that the public would celebrate this decision, that this would be embraced as, a great victory for the presidency, not Donald Trump or any other individual, but for the constitutional office of the presidency. He was so wrong. This was a reviled decision from the moment it dropped, including among many conservative commentators who are rightly afraid of how a corrupt Democrat could weaponize this decision to leverage their power in the Oval Office, to punish enemies, to violate civil liberties, to try to subvert a free and fair election. And Roberts just did not see that coming. And I think that shows how isolated
Let
he
me
is.
just read this one graph from the Times, because I really was struck by this, because this is not the type of things you read in the Times about John Roberts. In his writings on the immunity case, the Chief Justice seemed confident that his arguments would soar above politics, persuade the public, and stand the test of time. His opinion cited, quote, enduring principles, quoted Alexander Hamilton's endorsement of a vigorous presidency, and asserted it would be a mistake to dwell too much on Trump's actions. Quote, in a case like this one, focusing on transient results may have profound consequences for the separation of powers and for the future of our republic, he wrote. Our perspective must be more far-sighted, end quote. But the public response to the decision announced in July on the final day of the term was nothing like what his lofty phrases seemed to anticipate. I mean, they're basically saying, like, this guy's, however you want to phrase it, drinking the Kool-Aid, smelling his own, farts, whatever it is. And
I think that a premise of that decision, which is also a premise of the other two January 6 decisions that we're about to talk about, is that Donald Trump does not present a unique threat to constitutional democracy, that Donald Trump is not a heightened peril or threat or bomb aimed at self-governance in America and freedom in America. That Donald Trump is just another president who's controversial. Some people love him, some people hate him, but he's not anything special or different from what's come 200 years in the past. And so the court needs to treat him just the same as anybody else. And I think that's disastrously misguided. I think it's remarkable that Dick Cheney sees why that's wrong, but John Roberts does not.
But isn't that even irrelevant? Because the next president could be, and from my perspective, the next president certainly theoretically could be worse. I mean, than Donald Trump. I mean, the problem is that the real problem is that we just don't know how far anybody's going to go. I mean, the funny thing is that, like, to watch Roberts' behavior change with a 6-3 majority is the identical sort of like analogy to what does a Donald Trump or whomever, for that matter, do when they basically enter into office and know they more or less can't really get in trouble for anything they do as president. I mean, that, to me, seems to be the most problematic part about at least the ruling and Roberts jumping in there. All right, let's briefly talk about the Alito thing, because I also want, we only get about 6, 7, 8 minutes, and I want to be able to talk about the sort of the meta story here, which I think is really indicative of something that's going on in the court that I think is a process that's not going away.
Yeah, so the Alito thing is startling because, as the New York Times reported, and I think this is correct, it was unprecedented in the history of the court. Sometimes when the justices are writing opinions, one justice or two justices will flip their positions. So whoever was authoring the majority opinion will lose the majority opinion, and somebody new will write it because the outcome has flipped, right? But we now know that in the Fisher case, which was a case about whether federal prosecutors could charge many January 6th defendants under an obstruction statute, including Donald Trump, by the way. He was one of the January 6th defendants charged under the statute. Whether those charges could survive, whether the existing convictions could survive, or whether prosecutors in the federal government misread the obstruction statute and read it too broadly, and that a lot of these charges and convictions had to fail. And we now know that Alito was originally assigned to write the opinion saying that federal prosecutors did go too far, that the obstruction statute was narrower, that a lot of these January 6th defendants did deserve to be let off the hook, at least for this charge. But after the story came out that a upside down American flag hung over his household shortly after January 6th, that Roberts just seized the opinion from him and said, surprise, everyone, I'm now authoring this opinion, was not changing the outcome in any meaningful way. It was not some kind of flip behind the scenes. Roberts just said, this is now my case. And I think that just shows he doesn't care about ethics as an important thing in itself. He cares about optics, and he knew that the optics of Alito writing this opinion would be bad. So he took it over.
It seems to me to be a de facto acknowledgement that Alito should have recused himself.
Right. But there's no indication that Roberts pressured Alito to recuse. Certainly, Roberts didn't provide any kind of public statement that Alito should recuse, or any indication. I mean, my sense is that Roberts thinks all this ethics stuff is bogus, that it's just, sore losers on the left using whatever fodder they can to criticize the court. So he said, well, instead of, doing any kind of truly ethical move here and pressuring Sam to take himself off this case, I'll just write it instead. Really damning. And before we move on to the meta story, I just want to add the third case here, because it is a trio, and it's kind of like similar to both of these other two that we've discussed. This was the case about Trump getting removed from the ballot in Colorado, right? A case that Clarence Thomas should not have participated in because his own wife was, at the ellipse on January 6th, played a role in trying to overturn the election. The Colorado Supreme Court said that Trump couldn't run again because he had engaged in insurrection. And we now know that behind the scenes, actually, the four women justices, including Amy Coney Barrett, so the three liberals and Barrett, wanted to issue a very narrow, modest decision that would have narrowly said that what Colorado did here in this way was not allowed, but not opined on the broader issue. The four men, Kavanaugh, Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch, wanted to issue a sweeping decision that would essentially protect Trump from ever facing real consequences for his electoral future for participating in January 6th. And Roberts had a choice. He could have gone with the four women, or he could have gone with the four men to his right. And he went with the four men. And he authored a sweeping decision that basically nullified a clause of the 14th Amendment that said insurrectionists can't return to office. Just another example of Roberts ignoring major ethical issues in his own house in the Supreme Court, right? And then deciding to cast his lot with the most extreme possible outcome when he had options for compromise right there on the table.
Okay. So let's talk about the fact that we know this, because as far as I can remember, I can list off two other times where there have been leaks. The ACA decision back, I guess this was in 2012, there was somebody leaked, I think it was to the Wall Street Journal, and it was somebody clearly upset that Roberts was sort of not going far enough or something to that effect, or was bitching about Roberts, if I remember correctly. And then, of course, we had the big Dobbs leak. The leak of the decision. But even prior to the decision, somebody was talking who knew inside stuff. I think it was to Wall Street Journal again. So here we have and I think it's important to note, like, people have relationships with specific media outlets. And conservatives tend to have relationships with places like the Wall Street Journal And I'm now guessing that maybe some liberals have some relationships with the New York Times. We're looking at emails that are going back and forth here. We're looking like internal documents that we never, ever, ever see. And I'm curious as to like how you think, like what's going on that this is being leaked.
So from everything I know covering the court for more than a decade, I can tell you with a lot of confidence, these kind of leaks, this level of leak does not happen unless a justice authorizes someone to leak it. I think it is very clear from the material we have and the way that it is framed and the level of detail that we were given that a justice authorized a leak to the New York Times. Maybe one, maybe two. I think almost certainly, based on what was leaked, a justice on the left, but, we can't say for certain. And, because I ultimately am still sort of guessing here, I want to preserve the possibility that maybe some former clerks went rogue after their term ends. The clerk changeover happens in July, and I think it's notable that this story came out in mid-September. That would leave just the right amount of time for former clerks who clerked last term to go to the New York Times and leak this information and have the New York Times, report this story out. If that is what happened, then the timing just lines up. It's always possible that someone who happened to have information behind the scenes went rogue again and was not authorized by a justice, but it really rarely happens. I mean, I'm still convinced that Clarence Thomas authorized the leaks about the ACA decision in 2012, and that either Clarence Thomas or Sam Alito authorized the leaks about Dobbs before the draft was actually released, to the public in the big leak. And so here I think there's a real chance that a liberal justice is so fed up with what's happening that they're doing the kind of 5-alarm fire thing, and that they're saying, we can't just leave this to our dissenting opinions to express our concern here. We need the American people to be reading the crap that's going on behind the scenes. Kavanaugh and Gorsuch showering Roberts with sycophancy, Roberts getting MAGA-pilled and going all in for Trump. The people need to see what's going on so that they understand that this is a court that's been corrupted by politics. Again, I'm not speaking from any inside information. I was not privy to these leaks, and Jody Cantor and Adam Liptak have not told me how they got them, nor will they, nor should they. But my sense is that this was at a minimum greenlit or sort of eyebrow raise and wink approved by a justice to get to the media and get to the public.
My speculation, based upon maybe even less, is exactly the same. And although I will add that, and maybe this is just my nature in terms of like, seeing a little more drama or intrigue, we should note that there was an investigation that lasted for months and months and months as to who leaked the Dobbs decision, and presumably who would have contacted the Wall Street Journal so they could write about what was happening with the Dobbs decision before it was leaked. And the court apparently, despite the fact that they have just about every single possible investigatory resource available to human beings on the planet, because they could go to the NSA. I mean, like, the idea that there's no, that this trail just went cold, I find really hard to believe. And I can't help but wonder if the liberal justices saw like, oh, okay, you're not going to hold Alito to account for this, then the gloves are off, because we all know who did this. It seems to me that on the court, they must all be fairly clear on, who did what. And they're basically saying, now we get to do a couple of these too. And it just strikes me that, and I think we saw a couple of weeks ago, Kagan was out there saying that we think there should be some type of reform, or at least I do, in terms of ethics. Like this war that seems to be going on, like it's erupting in a way that I don't think we've seen, at least I haven't, since reports in the summer of 2001 that the court had a serious rift in the wake of the Bush v. Gore ruling.
I agree that it must be a very poisonous atmosphere behind the scenes. And I'll just add, the investigation after the Dobbs leak was a total joke. It was not designed to produce any meaningful information. It ended up being sort of like a witch hunt. They, searched the clerks' phones. They didn't do any real, under oath interviews with the justices themselves. They basically ensured that the justices would get off scot-free and wouldn't face any real scrutiny. One of the only true impacts of that leak and the follow-up and the investigation and the report is that the court told us the universe of employees who are going to have access to these internal deliberations is going to get smaller. We're going to reduce the number of people within the court who can see the deliberations and the draft opinions and, the justices' conversations to try to avoid a leak happening like this again, which tells us that if there is a leak, as there now has been, that there is an even greater chance that the person who either provided the materials or authorized the materials to be leaked was a justice or someone very close to a justice. That, lower level and even mid-level employees are no longer privy to this information, and they can kind of be taken off the suspect list. And I think an unintended consequence of that was to make it easier for us, the public, to take a very strong educated guess about who is giving this material to the press.
Yeah, somebody inside the court is basically saying, we've got a problem here, and it's clear that the Biden administration had no interest in sort of going down this road. Donald Trump obviously put these people on there, so he's like, okay, mission accomplished. But I wonder if this type of stuff being leaked, I mean, there have to be people within the Harris camp, people are obviously involved in a campaign, but this is not going to go unnoticed by this is, you're basically watching one, if not three of the Supreme Court justices, it seems to me, saying, we're sending up a warning signal, here's a flare. People should start following this a little bit because they did this for a reason, yes. Not just so that, we could have some interesting weekend reading. Somebody on the Supreme Court is doing this for a reason. And I wonder if it's to change some minds on the Senate judiciary, too.
I think that is almost certainly correct. And I think that if Kamala Harris happens to win a congressional majority and the presidency, that they should take a hard look at the warning signs coming left and right from the Supreme Court and ask themselves, do we really want to ignore the fact that these liberal justices may be putting themselves on the line here to warn us and the public that something must be done or we're heading in an even darker direction?
Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer at Slate, always a pleasure. Thanks so much. We will link to this piece by you and Dahlia Lithwick at majority.fm.
Thanks.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.